Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome, everyone. Very excited for our webinar today. Maybe if folks want to thread into the chat where they're dialing in from today, and then we'll get started in just a minute. Looks like we already have quite a few folks logging in from Copenhagen, Princeton, close to me in New York. Excellent. Okay, we're going to get started probably in about 1 minute. Excellent. We've got some folks from Louisville, Montreal, Brooklyn. Good to see you, Anthony. Great. Well, welcome everyone. Very excited to have you here today. We are going to be talking about AI strategy for the CPG industry. So looking specifically at what are the challenges that CPG leaders face today, what's the role of AI in helping to address those, some specific use cases, and then examples that we see of how companies are successfully managing the transformation to a more AI native way of managing growth and transformation within the CPG industry. And very excited to have everyone here today for this. So as I went through the unique challenges in CPG, we're going to talk a little bit about how we see the world of AI evolving, some example use cases and opportunities, and then what it takes to capitalize on those opportunities. I am joined here by my colleague, Phil. Phil, maybe if you want to introduce yourself.
Yes, absolutely. And hello, everyone. I'm Philip. I founded BOI and currently CEO, dialing in from Antwerp, Belgium today. And lovely to be with you all.
Excellent. Thanks, Phil. And I'm Jeff Gibbons. I'm a managing director here at BOI based out of New York, and look forward to the conversation today. We'd love to make it a conversation, so please feel free to put questions and comments into the chat. We're going to have some polls, we'll keep it interactive, and then also have the chance to address any questions that you have in the chat, so please drop them in. Quick introduction for those of you who don't know BOI. We're an AI services company focused on AI in the enterprise. We're really about driving real outcomes from the deployment of AI solutions within the enterprise, looking at strategy, how do we actually get leaders to understand AI, what's your right strategy, how do you look at governance, building solutions and implementing them, and then actually working with companies on their innovation strategy and how do they use AI to fuel innovation and growth more broadly across the enterprise. So if we think specifically about the unique challenges in CPG, we do a lot of work within the CPG industry at BOI, and we've done a lot of work specifically in the last 2 or 3 years around how to actually make the most of AI within that industry. And it's been, I'd say, one of the early adopters as an industry of AI solutions, and we see some specific challenges and opportunities that we'll go through. I think overall, the CPG industry is tough and specific in its needs. So the first thing we'd point to is that you have very emotional brand-led decisions from a consumer standpoint. So you need to think about how can you build personal connection with consumers, even though you don't have like a direct contact with them. You also have massive volume and very tight margins, which means you have to really think carefully about inventory and forecasting and how to manage that in a competitive context. There's a very complex customer and partner ecosystem where you're working through retailers as an intermediary. You don't necessarily have a direct connection with the consumer or even data on them. If we think about what it takes to be agile, you have physical products that require huge factories to produce them. It's not very easy to change a product on the fly. You also have very complex supply chains, which are getting more complex seemingly each year in the last few years to manage. And so you have to think carefully about how do you actually manage those things and make confident decisions around your manufacturing base, around your supply chain. And then the last thing is that there are regulatory and ethical nuances to think about, which are very specific even to individual categories and individual geographies. And so you have to manage that very carefully as a company in order to avoid reputational risk, but also stay up to up to speed with competition, especially smaller competitors who maybe face fewer risks from being sued, to be very specific. So first of all, we're going to take a quick poll around where you see the most challenge at the moment within working within the CPG industry. So you'll see on the right-hand side, there is a quick poll, and you can vote on where you see the biggest challenge currently. And we'll have a quick discussion around that. Phil, any comments on the poll?
I can't seem to see the results yet. Not sure if you're seeing them.
I'm having the same thing. Okay, well, we'll keep moving forward, and then we'll come back to the results in a minute. So, in terms of what role AI can play in solving problems in CPG, we'll try to break this down by the different challenges. So, as it relates to the problem of emotional brand-led decisions, their importance, the role that AI can play is actually how can you foster deeper personal connection with consumers and customers through personalization, through understanding their underlying drivers, but also how do you actually drive creativity, which is critical in this industry, in everything from communications to actually how you engage with consumers through their experiences. The second thing is how can you actually improve the way that we forecast demand and inventory to manage margins. So we'll talk about some examples of what we've been doing with clients on that front. Next, we think about with the complex customer and partner ecosystem where you're somewhat disconnected from the consumer. The challenge is actually how can we be successful amid this lack of data and direct consumer connection? And so we've got some examples of how companies are actually tapping into new data sets to build a deeper understanding of their consumers and responding to those in real time. The next example we'll talk through is how can we make confident investments when change is very costly and supply chains are volatile? So we'll talk a little bit about how you can make those confident investments and the role that AI can play in making investment decisions, but also managing complex issues around supply chains, for example, around tariffs. We'll get into an example of that, which is a top of mind issue right now. And then the last piece is how can we actually stay agile amid consumer is changing all the time and complexity in compliance rules. So we'll talk a little bit about each of those issues.
In the meantime, I got the results in from the poll. It was a tight race, but most votes went to the complex customer and partner ecosystem, followed by the emotional brand-led decisions, and then massive volume, tight margins. So basically the top three in a different order.
Excellent. Thank you, Phil. So that's a perfect segue to our next poll, and we'll make sure that we can see the results this time for this one, which is if we think about these 5 areas of how we think AI can add value, where do you see the most potential in the next couple of years for your organization? Okay, and so if we think about that, looks like we have the most votes currently for improving the way we forecast demand and inventory to manage margins, and then staying agile amid changing consumer preferences. So in both issues, looking at rapidly changing dynamics and how do you stay ahead of them. Quite a clear lead for those two, actually.
Yep.
Okay. So now to take a step back, we'll talk a little bit about, briefly for the next few minutes, the way that we see the role of AI in the enterprise and how that's evolving, and then get specifically to examples of how that applies within the CPG industry. So we take a step back and think about the deployment of AI. The first thing that's really important is to understand these four things. The first is that how AI adoption works. We'll talk through three waves of how AI adoption works. We'll talk about Moore's law and how that's fueling an explosive proliferation of everything that's digital, new models, data sets. We'll talk about what it means to have competitive advantage today, which is not about the technology, it's about the integration of humans and AI in decision making. And then lastly, we'll look at what it will take in the future to gain competitive advantage. So around AI adoption, we see the same pattern across all different technologies in history, whether it's the advent of the internal combustion engine or electricity or telephony, whatever it might be, that it follows three waves. First of all, there is a wave around how to create efficiency within what already exists today to streamline operations, cut costs. The second wave is how do you actually improve quality and the output of systems and businesses. So it's obviously more efficient, but also enhancing the quality of that. So that might be, for example, better advertising, not just automating the creation of advertising, but actually getting to deeper, more personal connection and personalization within your advertising. And then the third wave we see, and these kind of run in parallel as we'll talk about, is the development of new systems and transformation. So this might be new business models, this might be new ways of going to market, but it's really around AI is not just improving the quality of things, it's actually looking at new ways of running your business entirely. And so we'll come back to this as we think about some of the example use cases that we have. The second thing we want to talk about is how Moore's law is fueling an explosive proliferation of everything. So Moore's law is really around how the cost of everything is driven down very rapidly in everything from the cost of chips to the cost of software development. And so what we're seeing is a rapid explosion within the AI world, and this has been going on especially over the last few months, of new sources of data. That data might be real data, or increasingly, as a lot of models are trained on now, synthetic data, which is used to improve the quality of models. The second thing is a proliferation of models. So you've probably seen two things in particular. One is the massive proliferation of new competitive models that compete with OpenAI, for example, DeepSeek being the most obvious one, but also these small models. So an example would be how Bayer in the crop sciences space have launched a new small language model that's specific to the agriculture industry around the sale of seeds, which they're now actually monetizing to other companies that they compete with. The third thing is the proliferation of agents. We're predicting that there will be more agents than people in the world by the end of this year. They can be active agents that are actively taking actions and decisions for you, or they could be passive agents that are simply acting on human input and commands. And then lastly, an explosion of interfaces. So as the cost of software development rapidly drops, we're seeing a shift towards new interfaces that are rapidly created and modified in the moment for individual users, but also the rise of invisible interfaces where there is actually no human interface, and you have an interface where agents are running in parallel to one another, collaborating and responding, for example, to voice prompts where there's no kind of screen or visible interface, but it's built all around you. And so what that means today is that competitive advantage comes from what we call human AI symbiosis. So obviously, we all know that you have to have good data to have effective AI solutions. You have to have the right models and think about how you might switch those out and change them over time. You have to have the right interfaces and even devices. But the real competitive advantage doesn't just come from the data and the tools, because everyone can access the same things, ultimately. It's also how do you actually build the integration of that data, of those tools, with the right people and talent, the right ways of working, the right business model that is AI native around that, and then also an ethics and governance approach to avoid risk and getting sued and losing your job in all these types of efforts. And so this human AI symbiosis is really how we see competitive advantage evolving in the next few years. And what this means is actually one of the important things in this is actually how do you manage different clock speeds of change? So AI can do things in seconds and minutes, and it can also modify itself within seconds and minutes. People they take a bit longer to do things. They can pick up new skills or new ways of working in hours or days. But if you think about teams and organizations, they are much slower to change and to move. That's more of a clock speed of weeks and months. And I think it's really important to think about the time it will take for organizations to actually absorb the impact, even of just the last 6 months of innovation in new models and tools, could be multiple years, like even just the innovations we've seen in the last few months. And so it's really important to manage this dynamic, to manage expectations around what's possible from a change standpoint, but also to manage the human journey of that. Also within this human symbiosis, you have to think about different use cases differently. So often people will talk about this concept of humans in the loop, which is probably one of the most common ways of AI and humans actually interacting. So this is where the human actually is very involved in the work that's going on, and the human has the primary decision authority. So that might be, for example, that AI is generating ideas for a new product, and a human is the one who's responsible for selecting which ones they want to take forward, and is very involved in the actual process of designing that solution. So that's often the most common, but there are multiple ways in which humans and AI can work together, and we're seeing an evolution of this over time. The next model we'd think about is a slightly more autonomous way of doing this, where you actually have a human on the loop. So humans will control key decisions, but only occasionally weigh in on the process and the work that's going on. And we'll share some examples of how that works. You also have situations where AI actually takes much more of the decision authority. So we'll talk about some examples within content marketing around how AI will basically be making a lot of decisions around what content should be created, but then a human plays a very hands-on role in actually vetting any content that's launched. And then lastly, we have the most autonomous of all of these models, which is called human out of the loop. And this is where AI really is tasked with decision making, and there's very minimal human process engagement in that. And we'll talk about some use cases where that actually makes the most sense. So I think it's really important to understand when we think about humans and AI working together, what's the right way they should be acting together. And it's not necessarily the case that humans being involved in every step of the work is the right solution. And then the last thing we'll talk about is just in the future, we see that competitive advantage will go beyond AI as we think of it today in terms of chatbots that look at text and videos and sound. We're also seeing that AI is evolving in parallel to innovations in the physical world through biotechnology and robotics. And that if you think about a CPG company, you have a very large physical footprint of trucks and distribution centers and aisles in retail stores, which needs to be thought about as it relates to the deployment of AI. And AI will really become enmeshed in the physical environments that we actually live and work in, and your consumers and customers sell in. So this could look everything like the evolution of AI chatbots, personal AI agents that are making assistants, AI augmented drivers driving trucks to Walmart or wherever. We then think about a lot of other use cases. So for example, exoskeletons that amplify the ability of people within warehouses to manage distribution, AR and AI glasses and devices and wearables that actually improve the effectiveness of, say, salespeople going to set up promotions in stores. All the way through to the neural control of machines in the far future, but also humanoid robots that may play a role within factories. And so we think about AI in terms of how does it work, moving from knowledge work to the physical footprint of a CPG company, everything from the factories to the way that products are distributed. So take a pause here and see if there's any questions at this stage. Any you want to pick up on, Phil?
So no questions yet. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A tab or in the chat. No questions so far, Jeff.
Okay, awesome. Okay, great. So getting into some of the unique opportunities for AI and CPG, we'll now go through.
Sorry, there was one just coming in from Jason asking us on thoughts on the time horizon for these, which I assume is related to your previous slide on the embodied AI.
Yeah, okay, so time horizon. Okay, well, so I think everything in the bottom right hand corner, we're probably looking at sort of the next 1 to 2 years, maybe 18 months maximum, I would say, for all of those pieces. You could probably say actually most of them are already happening now. The top left, in terms of exoskeletons, AI-enabled prosthetics, collaborative robots, probably the sort of a 2 year horizon. I know that there are already, for example, exoskeletons that are helping people in warehouses already commercially available. AR and AI glasses have been around for a while. I think probably the next 2 years. Humanoid robots, I would say probably we're looking at a 3 to 5 year time frame, and neural controller machines. I don't know, Phil. Tell me what you think, but I think that's probably more like a 10 year kind of time frame.
Yeah, that would be my guess as well, 5 to 10 years, and I agree with the other timings. Just one more question that came in on, can you touch upon ethical AI?
Yes, absolutely. So I think the way that we think about ethics at BOI is really around understanding what are the key risks that you have around the deployment of AI, and then setting your intent as to how you actually want to manage those risks, and making sure that that's built into everything from the role that humans play in the loop or out the loop, as it might be, but also actually using AI to help improve that. So one of the things we actually see is that AI can actually play a strong role in spotting ethical blind spots, and we'll talk about an example of that as it relates to helping to make investment decisions. And so I think there's a role for humans to play in ethics, but also a role for AI in actually providing a check to humans and a reminder of some of the principles that might have been set out by a company policy, but people might forget about in their day-to-day work.
Yeah, I think that's a super interesting perspective, in a way that AI is probably more rigorous in applying certain principles than a collective set of humans would be. And I think it's often overlooked to actually deploy AI for ethics rather than just human perspectives to ethics. Maybe one more question we'll be picking up on before we progress is from Joris. What level of investment should organizations consider with this different horizon, tech and people? And maybe a quick perspective from my side. So I don't think there's a single pointed answer to that question. Obviously, you have rules of thumb around the 70-20-10 perspective on portfolio investments, where you invest 70% on re-engineering, reinventing your current business, 20% on adjacent opportunities, 10% on more disruptive opportunities, which I guess is a good rule of thumb, but it very much depends on your strategic future view of the industry and how much you think it will be affected and changed by AI. If the whole industry is going to look differently, then you would need to invest much more into the second and third pocket, versus if you have a strategic plan or a vision that won't be the case. So to me, it's very dependent on how you look at the future disruption in your industry, and then working backwards from that on where you allocate your investments across the different levels portrayed here.
Yeah, and I would say if you think about the CPG industry relative to others that are more regulated, I think probably the pace of change and disruption is going to be higher within the CPG industry than others. So you might think about a slightly more aggressive mix of investment towards waves 2 and 3. Okay, so to get some specific examples of how we're seeing opportunities play out in CPG, well, I'll try, Jason, to your question, to talk a little bit about what's real, what's happening now. And I'd say in all of these cases, they're pretty much all deployed to some extent. Okay, so the first question is, how can we foster deeper personal connection and creativity? The first example we'll talk about is a campaign run by Pedigree in Australia. So Pedigree is a pet food brand. They have been running a campaign, which is a remarkably creative campaign, where they actually have a model and a system whereby they are picking up on real-time data around dogs that are available for adoption in a certain area. So like, let's say in Melbourne, for example, it will literally take an image from the shelter, modify that to their brand standards, put it on an ad on a billboard, let's say, for example, in this picture. And then as soon as that dog is adopted, it will provide a new dog. And the new dog will be visualized on the billboard, and you can actually use the QR code to adopt this dog. Remarkable in its creativity and its usage of real-time data, and also making the ad campaign very relevant to the specific person who's looking at that billboard. The second example we see is a proliferation of AI-powered creative tools within communications. So one example that has received a lot of attention recently is a platform called Springboards, where it's really actually looking very closely at how do humans work very closely with an AI co-pilot effectively to develop deeper insights and to develop more creative campaigns. So I know a lot of folks probably think back about 18 months ago when every newsletter and every ad you could tell was written by ChatGPT 3.5. There's a lot of innovation now, and actually how do you drive deeper creativity through the use of AI in for example, campaign and communications.
Maybe just adding a perspective, Jeff, to the pedigree example, because people in the chat are loving that example, it seems. It's a really interesting one because it's a good example of not focusing just on wave one. We've seen other brands launching AI-generated campaigns, which have been just the same old commercials, but generated by AI, whereas this is a clear example of a campaign that wasn't possible before. And that really taps into the new technological possibilities that AI makes available to us. And so I think it's a great example of more of a wave two, wave three type transformation.
Absolutely. And I think, yeah, this is an example of this human on the loop model where it doesn't make sense for a human to be literally monitoring every dog that's put on a billboard, but they have a system whereby the image from the shelter is modified to the brand standard. So they've created a system and a framework so that humans don't have to be involved in every step of modifying the image and putting the image there, and actually have different ways of creating different views of the animal too, on an automated basis. The second thing we're looking at is how can we improve the way we forecast demand and inventory to manage margins. So these are examples of two different solutions we've been deploying with clients. The first was working with a food company on a product and flavor forecasting engine. So this is a tool that's now been deployed within the client organization that helps to pull in data from multiple different sources to forecast out over the next 5 to 10 years which flavors they should be looking at from a food standpoint that will help them to stand out. Given that everyone has trend reports over the next 2 or 3 years, how can they develop a competitive advantage in forecasting further out and making R&D investments around those? The second example is working with a company in the fashion industry around a product design and distribution tools. So this is a tool that actually pulls in data from TikTok, from runway data, that generates designs of actual garments. Those garments have tested well. Actually, they've exceeded the quality from a consumer standpoint of the existing best-selling items from the company. And then actually it generates marketing materials and then identifies where that product should be distributed on the basis of how trends are shifting within the market. And they're now actually deploying this and looking at integrating things like weather data. So how can you actually go beyond just forecasting demand, but also managing inventory in new ways? The next question we have is how can we be successful amid a lack of data and direct consumer connection? So I think there are two areas that we see that have started. They're probably more nascent, especially the one on the right. The first is actually around the availability of new data sources. So probably a bunch of you have seen these in-store robots going around grocery stores. They are looking at where is there an out of stock issue and helping to direct employees within the store to figure out where they should be restocking. These are all new data sources to pick up on everything around out of stocks, but also to pick up on everything around them. So those robots can be understanding what products are people picking off the shelf, and think of it as a live way of understanding what's generating interest. And so we see a lot of potential for CPG companies to be using all of the visual data and even the sound data around these robots to be tapping into a new source of understanding, which would be mediated by that robotics company, of course, and potentially the retailer. And then the second thing is actually CPG companies actually building their own consumer profiles themselves. So this is something we've been working with one CPG company on, is what would be the way they would actually directly create dynamic synthetic profiles of individual consumers and build a database of those so that they can personalize campaigns based on the signifiers that they have around an individual consumer and personalize communications to them, but also build a real-time view of what individual consumers are doing, bypassing the retailer in ways that they can. The next two examples are really around how can we use AI to make confident investments when change is costly and supply chains are volatile. So the first example, this is an example of a very strong human AI collaboration. So there's a company, I hope I'm going to pronounce this right, but Phil, you might know this better, Gieswein, which is a shoe company in Europe, in Austria. They actually ran an experiment, a real study, where they literally created an AI tool that was a board member on the company's board. And so they would run board meetings and they would be actively prompting using ChatGPT, basically, to run questions by it, to run decisions by it, and actually use it as an active participant in their board meetings. So they actually found a few interesting things from this. The first one was actually, it was very helpful, technology aside, just to have the ability to step back and take a bit of a break during the meeting, which was kind of a silly thing, but actually made a huge impact on how they made decisions. The second one was that it helped them to identify blind spots and be more exhaustive in their questioning around a topic, as Phil was talking about earlier, around how you could have a sort of checklist of ethical questions that you might address around a question. But they also identified that there were some blind spots that they assumed the AI would cover but weren't covered. So there's like a level of overconfidence that they also gained within this tool, which they had to be cautious of. And then the last thing was that they actually saw that it managed to make investment decisions much easier and faster. So they actually were looking at the cost of renovating a facility in Slovakia. They actually managed to run some very quick estimates in real time in a board meeting, and they felt like it was good enough to make a decision around whether or not to refurbish that factory. They even actually ran a prompt to actually write a press release on the basis of this, which they actually used more or less completely after using that in the board meeting. The second example I'll go through is looking at a very real topic for a lot of companies, especially in the US, around the impact of tariffs. And so this is a proof of concept tool we've been sharing with some companies around how to actually look at navigating the impact of tariffs, let's say for Canada and Mexico, purely as examples, to understand the cost impact of those. And so what we have here is a simple tool that helps you to understand the impact on pricing and inventory of changes in tariffs and how that breaks down to individual products. So this is a sort of a mocked up dashboard, so you can understand the tariff exposure and how that varies for different products and what are the key risks that they face from sort of an industry inventory standpoint, out of stocks, and then the ability to actually modify what the impacts of tariffs are and how that has an impact on your cost profile, what pricing impact it might have, how you look at inventory and strategies around how to manage inventory, whether that's ordering ahead of time or not, how that breaks down to individual products and the risk level that you see with individual products. And then lastly, getting to a view of what's the actual advice that the tool could give you that as a human you could assess and see what your roadmap of changes might be in managing change around tariffs. So this is an example of some of the things that we're seeing pop up with clients in the current environment. And then the last one here is looking at how can we stay agile amid changing consumer preferences and compliance rules. So these are two programs that we're working on at the moment with clients. The first one is actually an interesting one. So this is the only example we've gone through so far of what we call AI in the loop. So this is a situation where AI is actively making a lot of decisions, but humans are very involved in checking everything. So we're working with a spirits company, looking at how they can actually generate content for content marketing purposes on blogs, for example, around cocktails and spirits in an autonomous way, but so there's a system of agents that are creating content based on what consumers are searching for in LLMs, and then generating that content. But there's a human approval step because of the rules around compliance and responsible advertising within the spirits industry. So there's a human check very strongly at every step of the content publishing process. And then the last one is a tool that we're building for a consumer healthcare company, which we're calling a maximizer tool. So this is a tool that is picking up on information out there in the market around competitive claims, pricing, distribution data, and using that to autonomously generate insights on how they should be looking at their products and what they can do to modify their own pricing and claims and communications and distribution strategy to improve their success in market. So this is an example of what we call human on the loop, where the tool is actually just searching for information autonomously and providing that information to the human, who is actually not that involved in the running of the tool, but gets advice that they can act upon or not on the basis of what decisions they want to make as a human. So take a pause there and see if there's any other questions, Phil.
Well, people are loving the examples, it seems. There was one more question that I'm happy to throw in here. How do you think about human agency, especially in a world of AI agents taking decisions for us? Maybe one perspective that I have on that is that I think our level of agency might shift from micro decisions, deciding on every micro decision in our day-to-day lives, to more meta decisions, rather than which flavor am I going to buy, which route am I going to take. The decision or the agency sits more with which agent do I trust to take those decisions on my behalf, or which intent do I give to my agent in terms of which indicators to score or evaluate different options on. So I think our level of agency will shift more to a meta level, more of an intent-based level, more of a selecting the right agent on our behalf. If there are any other questions in the meantime, feel free to still drop them in the Q&A section. There's one question coming in from Jessica just now. Jeff, maybe you can speak to that. I wonder what live data could these tools access in order to provide business decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. So Jessica's on this. So this example on the right here, working with a consumer healthcare company, we're looking at a range of different data sources. So part of it is actually developing agents that are effectively just web scraping. So they're looking at reviews on Amazon, on drugs.com, on target.com to pick up on consumer sentiments, as well as looking at social media sources. The other things we're looking at are FDA monographs. Are there changes from a regulatory standpoint we should be aware of? We're looking at, in this instance, actual sales data using a company called Circana to pull in data on that, as well as a range of other sources around consumer trends. We could see eventually this will pull in cost data as well. So you might think about like, how can you understand the cost side of things, and if there's a reformulation need that you might have as it relates to something.
All right.
I also see. No, go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, no, there's two more questions. One from Rachel, maybe with a really quick answer on like who is typically owning these type of initiatives in the CPG organization, which is varied for each of the examples. So the 10-year forecasting is typically more owned by R&D. The CMO or Chief Growth Officer, depending on the naming, is an owner for a lot of these, typically hybridly owned by an AI or digital transformation office. So we see a lot of hybrid funding between the marketing organization and the digital office, depending on the company. And then there's one more question from Sarab on the example here on the left of your slide, Jeff, if you could speak to the flow of that a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So this is an interesting one because it's AI in the loop. So AI is doing a lot, but there's a human check. So there's a series of agents. One agent is actually identifying what are the key topics that consumers want to learn about. So literally pulling in data from what people are prompting ChatGPT or Gemini about, as well as pulling in search data. So there's an agent that does that. There's then an agent that identifies content topics that content should be generated around. There's then two different agents, one that actually generates blog content, and then one that actually modifies that into the right tone of voice for a specific brand. And then the human role is there at every step before publication, which is to actually make sure that there's a compliance check around things like, let's say, sort of, responsible drinking, around advertising to children, like all these types of things that are very important within the spirits industry, and that the eventual goal is that you'd have let's say, a compliance agent that's playing a role more strongly, but we still think there's a human check at every stage of that.
Yeah, maybe one last question, and then you can push onwards, Jeff. So a quick question for Franco. Are these new tools replacing traditional platforms like Statistica, Nielsen, or others that many CPG firms are working with? So the short answer to me is no. Like typically they leverage the data and insights from those platforms and more specialized ones in CPG as well. But those tools are trying to create a competitive advantage by compiling those data sources into insights that competitors don't have. It's an additional layer on top, drawing from those insights and creating actionable recommendations or actions themselves that create a competitive advantage. Jeff, I know we only have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to give you the floor to take us till the end.
Okay, awesome. So first of all, we're going to do a quick poll around which of these 10 use cases we talked about do you think is most compelling? So I'm just looking at the votes as they start to flow in. It looks like we've got quite a bit of interest in, not surprising, the AI-powered dynamic marketing campaigns, like the pedigree example, the product forecasting engine, and then the dynamic consumer profiles of individual consumers as well. Those seem to be the ones that are rising to the top, particularly the dynamic marketing campaigns and the consumer profiles. Love that pedigree example. Such a creative use, and it was actually about a year ago. It wasn't even like they must have got on that very quickly. Okay, wonderful. So we will wrap up very quickly. The last two things we want to talk about is just how do you actually capitalize on the opportunity. The first thing is to start to think about it in terms of how do you not just do individual use cases, but how do you transition to an always-on growth model? So looking at the entire set of functions within a CPG company, and how do you think about all of the different use cases and how they stitch together? So the examples that we talked through, everything from, how do you formulate and design products? How do you look at forecasting? How do you look at running campaigns in new ways? The point is not to have one single use case, but actually to have a set of use cases that work together. So how can your sales enablement tool be picking up on trend forecasting tools, for example? And then how can you actually be looking at pulling in new data sources to actually manage your inventory? These are not separate use cases. It's all about how do you create an overall growth model that is sensing and helping you to make decisions more effectively on the basis of each of these use cases working together. And so we think a lot of the work is actually, once you've got some use cases and got some value, how do you stitch those together and transition your ways of working towards those? And then the last point we'll leave you with is just thinking about how you manage this through parallel investments in efficiency, improved quality, and growth. So we see that it's very important to look at how you can create some efficiency plays, which could be around how you automate marketing, for example, but then using the efficiencies from that to actually invest in the medium and longer term improvements that you need to make to transition towards this overall growth model. And so this is something that we think is the delicate balancing act between each of these different types of use cases that companies will have to manage to be effective. And in that, we think that for every dollar you invest in technology, you have to be thinking about investing $2 in people and change. The changing of the model and how you actually work is going to be the much harder thing, but that's actually where the competitive advantage will be sourced from as well. So the key takeaways are AI, we believe, is already having an impact in the CPG industry. Point solutions aren't enough. You need to think about how do different teams and functions collaborate differently and create this overall new way of working. And to lead, CPG companies need to invest in efficiency and growth simultaneously. Obviously, we do a lot of work in the CPG industry. We'd love to keep in touch with folks that would have an interest in working with us. Two things to leave you with. The first question would be if you would like us to facilitate a leadership workshop with your executive team to immerse in some of these use cases and help you set your strategy. And if you would be interested in an AI strategy sprint where we can help you set a vision, prioritize use cases, and also develop a clear view of what it will take to be successful from an org standpoint. So please let us know in the chat if you'd be interested in having a follow-up conversation, and then we will also be sharing the recording from this webinar as well.
That's right on time, Jeff. Thank you so much for taking us through, and thank you everyone for being here. As Jeff shared, we will share the recording, etc., with you over email. But for now, thanks a lot for your very active participation.
Thanks, everyone.